Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Dexter's fingers twitched with excitement. He'd been collecting dolls for years, but this was his first time attending such a large show. His gaze swept over porcelain faces and glass eyes, searching for something special to add to his collection. As he wandered down an aisle, a glint of polished wood caught his eye. He paused, drawn to an exquisite miniature dressing table. The rich mahogany gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its tiny drawers adorned with brass handles no bigger than his fingernail. Beautiful piece, isn't it? Dexter turned to see an elderly woman smiling at him, her gray hair neatly coiffed. It's stunning, he agreed. I've never seen craftsmanship like this before. It's quite rare, the woman said, her eyes twinkling. From the late 1800s. The perfect addition to any serious collection. Dexter ran his fingers over the smooth surface, imagining how it would look displayed in his study. How much? They haggled for a few minutes before settling on a price. As the woman wrapped the dressing table, Dexter's gaze fell on a delicate lavender dress hanging nearby. The silk shimmered softly, tiny seed pearls dotting the bodice. That would pair wonderfully with the table, the woman suggested. It's from the same era. Dexter hesitated only a moment before adding the dress to his purchase. He could already picture one of his favorite dolls wearing it, seated at the dressing table. As he waited for the woman to box up his items, something else caught his eye. A small medallion lay nestled in a velvet-lined case, its surface etched with the image of a winged figure. Is that an angel? He asked, leaning closer. Some say angel, some say fairy, the woman replied. No one knows for certain. It's quite old. Bronze, I believe. Would you like to take a closer look? Dexter nodded, and she carefully lifted the medallion from its case. As she placed it in his palm, a strange tingling sensation shot up his arm. He nearly dropped it in surprise. Everything all right? The woman asked, her brow furrowed. Fine, Dexter said quickly, handing it back. Just a bit of static electricity, I think. He paid for his purchases and left the show, the encounter with the medallion already fading from his mind as he imagined how he'd display his new acquisitions. Back home, Dexter carefully unpacked the dressing table and dress. He selected a porcelain doll with long, dark curls and placed her on the tiny chair, draping the lavender silk over her shoulders. Perfect, he murmured, adjusting the folds of the dress. As he stepped back to admire the display, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of his desk. The room spun for a moment before settling. Dexter shook his head, blinking rapidly. Perhaps he'd gotten overheated at the crowded show. He decided to lie down for a bit, hoping a short nap would help. When Dexter woke, the sun had set. He stretched, feeling oddly stiff. As he sat up, he noticed his shirt felt tighter across his chest. Frowning, he looked down and froze. Two small but distinct bumps protruded from his chest. What the hell? He muttered, poking at them in disbelief. He hurried to the bathroom, flicking on the light. His reflection stared back at him, mostly unchanged except for the newly formed body straining against his shirt. Dexter's mind raced. This had to be some kind of hallucination. Maybe he'd eaten something that disagreed with him? But as he prodded his chest, the new flesh felt all too real beneath his fingers. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to shock himself awake. When he looked in the mirror again, his features seemed softer somehow, his jawline less defined. Panic rising in his throat, Dexter stripped off his clothes. His body hair had thinned noticeably, and his hips seemed wider than before. He spun around, craning his neck to see his back. Was his waist smaller? This can't be happening, he whispered, gripping the edge of the sink. He took several deep breaths, forcing himself to think logically. There had to be a rational explanation for this. Maybe it was some kind of allergic reaction, or a hormone imbalance. Dexter threw on a loose sweatshirt and sweatpants, determined to hide the changes until he could figure out what was going on. He'd make an appointment with his doctor first thing in the morning. But sleep eluded him that night. Every time he started to drift off, he'd jerk awake, hands flying to his body to check if it was still soft. By morning, dark circles ringed his eyes, which now seemed larger and more almond-shaped. The doctor was baffled. Blood tests came back normal, and a hurried MRI showed no tumors or abnormalities that could explain the physical changes. Dexter left the office with a referral to an endocrinologist and a prescription for anti-anxiety medication he wasn't sure he'd fill. Over the next few days, the transformation accelerated. Dexter's hair grew longer and thicker, cascading past his shoulders in waves. His voice rose in pitch, and he found himself crossing his legs automatically when he sat. He called in sick to work, too afraid to leave the house. What if someone noticed? How could he possibly explain? As he paced his living room, Dexter's gaze fell on the dressing table and doll. The lavender dress seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. Without thinking, he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the silk, a jolt of electricity shot through him. He jerked his hand back with a yelp. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw the doll's eyes move. Dexter stumbled backward, his heart pounding. Was he going mad? He squeezed his eyes shut, counting to 10 before opening them again. The doll sat motionless, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. There had to be a connection between the doll's show and these impossible changes. But what? He racked his brain, trying to remember every detail of that day. The medallion. The memory hit him like a thunderbolt. That strange tingling when he'd touched it. Could that have triggered all this? Dexter leapt up, grabbing his keys. He had to get back to the convention center, find that woman again. Maybe she'd know what was happening to him. But when he arrived, the vast room was empty. A janitor mopping the floor told him the show had ended days ago. The vendors were long gone. Despair washed over Dexter as he trudged back to his car. He was running out of options and time. His body continued to change, becoming more feminine with each passing hour. Back home, he stood before the full-length mirror in his bedroom, barely recognizing the person staring back at him. Soft curves had replaced his once angular form. His face was heart-shaped now, with full lips and long lashes. Dexter's gaze fell on the lavender dress, still draped over the doll. Almost in a trance, he reached for it. The silk whispered against his skin as he slipped it on, the bodice molding perfectly to his new figure. He gasped, transfixed by his reflection. The dress fit as if it had been made for him. As he smoothed his hands over the fabric, a wave of dizziness crashed over him. Dexter stumbled to the bed, collapsing onto it as the room spun around him. His head throbbed, memories and images flashing behind his eyelids too quickly to grasp. When the vertigo finally subsided, he opened his eyes and froze. The room looked different somehow, larger. He sat up slowly, his gaze falling on his hands. They were tiny, with perfectly manicured nails. With growing horror, Dexter realized he was no longer on the bed, but seated at the miniature dressing table. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. He looked down at himself, seeing only the lavender dress and a porcelain body. "No," he whispered, his voice high and melodic. "This can't be real." But it was. Somehow, impossibly, he had become the doll. Panic clawed at him as he struggled to move, to speak louder than a whisper, but his new body refused to obey. He could only sit there, staring at his reflection in the tiny mirror. Hours passed, maybe days. Time lost all meaning as Dexter remained trapped in his porcelain prison. He tried to scream, to weep, but no tears would come. Then, one day, he heard a key in the lock. Footsteps approached, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was himself, or rather, the woman he had been becoming. She crossed the room, smiling down at him. "Hello, Romina," she said softly. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." Dexter tried to respond, to ask what was happening, but no sound came out. The woman, his body, gently lifted him from the chair. "Don't worry," she murmured. "Everything will make sense soon. You're home now." As her fingers brushed his porcelain skin, another wave of dizziness washed over him. Memories flooded his mind, but they weren't his memories. They belonged to someone else, to Romina. He saw flashes of a life long past, a little girl unwrapping a beautiful doll on Christmas morning, years of being treasured, played with, loved. Then darkness as he was packed away in an attic, forgotten. The medallion, its magic awakening him, giving him a chance at a new life, but he needed a body, a real human body. Dexter's consciousness began to fade as Romina's grew stronger. He fought against it, clinging to who he was. But it was like trying to hold on to smoke. "Don't fight it," the woman who had been Dexter said gently. "Let go. You'll be happier this way." The last of Dexter's memories slipped away. Romina blinked, looking up at the beautiful woman holding her. "Mama," she whispered. The woman smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "Yes, darling, I'm here." She hugged Romina close, and for the first time in over a century, Romina felt the warmth of a true embrace. She was no longer a doll, but a real girl. Human. Alive. As the days passed, Romina adjusted to her new life. Her mother, the woman who had once been Dexter, taught her everything she needed to know about living in the modern world. They told neighbors and co-workers that Romina was a long-lost niece who had come to live with her aunt after losing her parents. Romina threw herself into experiencing all the things she'd only been able to watch before. She delighted in the taste of food, the feeling of sun on her skin, the sound of her own laughter. But sometimes, late at night, she'd catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror and feel a flicker of something. A memory, perhaps, of another life, of being someone else. In those moments, she'd shake her head, dismissing the strange thoughts. After all, she was Romina. She'd always been Romina, hadn't she? Months turned into years, and Romina blossomed into a stunning young woman. Her long, dark curls and porcelain complexion turned heads wherever she went. She pursued a career in fashion design, drawing inspiration from the beautiful antique clothes she'd admired for so long. On her 25th birthday, her mother presented her with a gift, the medallion from the antique show. "It's been in our family for generations," she explained, fastening it around Romina's neck. "I think it's time you had it." As the cool metal touched her skin, Romina felt a faint tingle. For a moment, an image flashed in her mind, a man, examining the medallion at a crowded show. But it vanished as quickly as it had come. Romina smiled, touching the medallion. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you, Mama." That night, as she drifted off to sleep, the medallion gleamed in the moonlight. And somewhere in the depths of her subconscious, a voice that sounded nothing like her own whispered a name she didn't recognize. Dexter. But by morning, the whisper was forgotten, lost in the bright promise of a new day. Romina had a life to live, after all. A human life full of joy and pain and all the messy, wonderful things that came with it. And if sometimes she felt a strange sense of longing when she looked at her cherished doll collection, well, that was only natural, wasn't it? After all, she'd always loved dolls, hadn't she? As the years passed, Romina's life unfolded like a beautiful tapestry. She excelled in her fashion career, her designs gracing runways and magazine covers. Her unique style, inspired by the antique dolls she'd always adored, caught the eye of critics and fashionistas alike. But despite her success, Romina often felt a nagging emptiness she couldn't quite explain. She threw herself into her work, filling her days with sketches and fabric swatches as if trying to stitch together the missing pieces of herself. On her 30th birthday, Romina decided to treat herself to a solo vacation. She chose a quaint bed and breakfast in a small coastal town, hoping the change of scenery might spark some new design ideas. As she explored the town's winding streets, she stumbled upon a tiny antique shop tucked away in an alley. The window display featured an array of vintage dolls, their painted faces smiling enigmatically. Romina's heart quickened as she pushed open the door, a bell tinkling overhead. The shop was cluttered but cozy, every surface covered with curios and collectibles. "Can I help you?" Romina turned to see an elderly woman emerge from behind a towering bookshelf. Her gray hair was pulled back in a bun, and her eyes twinkled with warmth. "I was just browsing," Romina said. "I collect antique dolls." The woman's smile widened. "Then you've come to the right place. I have quite a selection in the back room. Would you like to see?" Romina nodded eagerly, following the woman through a beaded curtain. The room beyond was filled with dolls of every description: porcelain, cloth, wood, and more. As Romina examined them, her fingers brushing over delicate lace and smooth ceramic, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over her. She'd done this before, hadn't she? But not like this. Not in this body. She shook her head, trying to clear the odd thoughts. Her gaze fell on a doll seated at a miniature dressing table. It wore a lavender dress, its dark curls cascading over tiny shoulders. "Oh," Romina breathed, reaching for it. The moment her fingers touched the doll's porcelain skin, a jolt of electricity shot through her. She gasped, stumbling backward. "Are you all right, dear?" the shopkeeper asked, steadying her. Romina blinked rapidly, her head spinning. I'm not sure," she mumbled. The room seemed to waver around her like a mirage in the desert. For a moment, she saw double, the cluttered shop overlaid with a different room, a bedroom she somehow knew but couldn't place. "Perhaps you should sit down," the woman said, guiding her to a chair. "You've gone quite pale?" Romina sank into the seat, her legs trembling. As the dizziness subsided, she found herself staring at the doll again. Something about it tugged at her memory, like a word on the tip of her tongue. "That doll," she said slowly. "Where did you get it?" The shopkeeper followed her gaze. "Ah, that one. It came from an estate sale a few years back. Quite valuable, actually. The outfit is original, and the dressing table is a matching piece." Romina nodded absently, her eyes fixed on the doll's painted face. It looked so familiar, like looking in a mirror almost, a mirror. The thought hit her like a thunderbolt. Suddenly she was elsewhere, standing before a full-length mirror, watching in horror as her body changed, becoming softer, curvier, becoming... "Romina!" She jerked her head up, meeting the shopkeeper's concerned gaze. "I'm sorry," she said. "What did you say?" The woman frowned. "I didn't say anything, dear, but you just whispered a name. Dexter, I think it was..." Romina's breath caught in her throat. Dexter. The name echoed in her mind, unlocking a flood of memories she didn't know she had. The antique show, the medallion, the impossible transformation, being trapped in a porcelain body, watching as someone else, something else, took over her life. No, not her life. His life. "Oh, God," Romina whispered, her voice cracking. "What's happening to me?" The shopkeeper's expression softened with understanding. "I think you know, dear," she said gently. "You've known all along, haven't you? Deep down?" Romina, no, Dexter, looked up at her, tears blurring his vision. "How?" he choked out. "How is this possible?" The woman sighed, settling into a nearby chair. "Magic is a tricky thing," she said. "It doesn't always work the way we expect. The medallion was meant to give life, but it needed a vessel. A body." "But why me?" Dexter asked. "Why did it choose me?" "It didn't choose you," the woman replied. "Romina did. She saw in you a kindred spirit, someone who appreciated beauty, who understood the value of forgotten things." Dexter shook his head, struggling to process it all. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Can you change me back?" The woman's eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm afraid not," she said softly. "The magic has taken root too deeply. This is who you are now." Dexter buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Everything he'd known, everything he'd been, gone, replaced by a life that wasn't truly his. And yet, he thought of the joy he'd felt these past years, the thrill of creating beautiful things, of feeling truly alive for perhaps the first time. Had that all been a lie? It wasn't a lie, the woman said, as if reading his thoughts. Those feelings were real. Romina gave you a gift, a chance to experience life in a way you never had before. Dexter looked up, wiping his eyes. But what about my old life? My memories? Who I was before? The shopkeeper reached out, patting his hand gently. Those things are still a part of you, she said. They always will be. But you have a choice now. You can cling to the past, or you can embrace the future, the life you've built. Dexter's gaze drifted back to the doll, to Romina. He remembered the loneliness she'd felt, trapped in that porcelain body for so long, the yearning for a real life, for human connection. Wasn't that something he'd felt too, in his old life? Always on the outside, collecting beautiful things but never truly experiencing them? Slowly, he stood, his legs steadier now. He approached the doll, gently lifting it from the dressing table. Thank you, he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to Romina or to some greater force he didn't understand. The shopkeeper smiled, rising to join him. What will you do now? She asked. Dexter took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I'm going to live, he said. Really live. For both of us. He purchased the doll and dressing table, carefully wrapping them in tissue paper. As he turned to leave, the shopkeeper called out to him. Don't forget this, she said, holding out a small object. It was the medallion. Dexter hesitated before taking it, feeling the familiar tingle as it touched his skin. Are you sure? He asked. What if... The woman chuckled. Don't worry, she said. Its magic is spent, but it's part of your story now. Both of your stories. Dexter nodded, slipping the medallion into his pocket. As he left the shop, he felt lighter somehow. The confusion and fear that had plagued him melted away, replaced by a sense of purpose. He had a life to live, a beautiful, complex, fully human life, and he intended to make the most of every moment. Years later, Romina, for that was the name she'd chosen to keep, sat at her desk, putting the finishing touches on her latest design. Her studio was filled with antique dolls, each one carefully restored and displayed. In a place of honor sat the lavender-clad doll and dressing table. Romina smiled at it fondly, touching the medallion that always hung around her neck. Thank you, she whispered, as she did every day, for the gift of life, of beauty, of second chances. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.